So, you've decided you're procrastinated enough, and now you're ready to finally begin your research paper. But where do you begin? Well, doing the research is a good place to start. Before you begin the research, there are two things you must consider. One is to make sure you establish a personal ethical code before beginning your research. But what exactly does that mean? Well, have you heard of the Hippocratic Oath? You probably haven't, but you've probably heard of its practices. The Hippocratic Oath is a moral code for ethical conduct and practice in medicine. In other words, it's a promise made by newly graduated physicians they will follow ethical principles in the practice of medicine. The same principles must be made when conducting any type of research. Do no harm to anybody involved in your research. That should include any physical or psychological harm, like revealing personal, private information. A good example of this unethical research is the unethical research by the Nazi Party during World War II. Karl Brandt was a personal physician of Adolf Hitler, and after the war was charged with the crime of human experimentation. At the Nuremberg trial, he was convicted, and the Nuremberg Code was founded as a basis for ethical research. The Belmont Report was established in 1974 by the United States government, which contained three core concepts of ethical research. 1. Respect for persons. 2. Beneficence. And 3. Justice. Now, the second thing you must take into consideration is researcher bias. But what is researcher bias? Well, researcher bias is where the researcher performing the research influences results. There are 7 different types of biases that can occur when performing any kind of research. The first is design bias. It occurs when the researcher fails to take into account the inherent biases in the experiment. The second is sampling bias. This occurs when the process of sampling actually introduces an inherent bias. Within sampling bias there are actually 2 other biases. There is omission bias, when a certain variable is left out intentionally, and inclusive bias, when certain variables are included for their inconvenience. The next one is procedural bias. This occurs when an unnecessary amount of pressure is placed upon the subject to complete a certain task. Then there is measurement bias. This is when there is an error in the data collection and measuring. Next is interviewer bias. This is actually one of the hardest ones to avoid since the research has a direct, yet sometimes unknown effect on the outcome. Another bias to be wary of is response bias. This occurs when the interviewee gives a response to the researcher that he or she thinks they want to hear. Last but not least is reporting bias. This occurs when there is a failure to interpret and present the results of the experiment into the literature. So perhaps now you have an understanding of researcher bias and ethics. I hope this helped, and now you can be sure to keep these 2 things in mind the next time you perform any kind of research.
Created using Hawthorne.